gonna be great. Okay, so I'm going from the long email you responded to my old presentation thing from 6 years ago, and you were saying that my views were old man's view on investing, and it's not necessarily
Right.
bad, but in your humble opinion, it doesn't resonate with today's investors.
Right.
And
So,
okay,
like, I'm really glad that I get a chance to talk to you because I feel like you're pretty uniquely qualified to talk about this stuff. So obviously, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and America's in the worst recession slash depression since 1929, the Great Depression. Um, it's worse, isn't it, than the 1929 Great Depression?
I
Like, there, I
mean,
think the media is trying to soften it for us to say that it's not worse, but I feel like it is worse. I don't have any evidence to back that up right now. Not concrete evidence, but from what I've seen and from what I keep hearing, and just from what I think is common sense, it seems like it is worse than the 1929 Great Depression, and that's the reality of it. Am I wrong? Am I inaccurate?
I mean, it's still early days, right? So we don't
Yeah.
really know because it's easy to look back at the Great Depression and be like, okay, well, this was like a 20-year period that was horrible until we went into World War again and we started boosting up all this stuff. But
Right.
and so like and COVID's it's not a world war. Like it's affecting the whole world. In fact, it might affect more people, but it's different, right? It's not like you have to actually worry about like going outside and like someone's gonna drop a bomb on you. But like if someone
Right.
coughs on you, yeah, you might get sick. And if you're old or you're really young, it might affect you particularly more.
Yeah.
Economy wise, like yeah, I mean, unemployment number wise, it looks pretty bad, but we had to have, I think, a proper perspective here. This has only been, it's August now, so, you know, most of the places started doing quarantines and shutdowns in March. So it's been 5 months. That's less than 6 months, right?
Yeah.
And usually all these economic indicators and statistics and studies are kind of like every month, every quarter. Some of them are weekly, but like you need some time to like digest it,
You
like
do,
and
for sure.
and see what happens, right? There's also external factors like well we're already trying to adapt to it. We have stimulus stuff and unemployment, 600 bucks a week, and all that kind of stuff, and that can change things too, right? Like now that the 600 bucks has ended, maybe it'll be a lot worse in a few months. Like it's hard to say. And then we have elections. It's pretty big year. So
Yeah, we got a lot going on.
better or worse, I mean, maybe if you look at just unemployment numbers, it's like close to that, but it may be temporary.
Yeah.
But I would say it's not even close when you think about like, well, I think back in the Great Depression, like people were starving. They had to line up for food. They had to live
That's
with like
happening
10
now,
people
though.
in a house. Like
That's
that's.
happening now.
I'm not
Like
saying
in
that's
some
not
parts of the
happening,
country, there are
but it's
people
not. It's
lined
not
up
en
for
masse.
miles in cars. You know?
But it's not en masse, is what I mean. Like in
Yeah.
general, like yes, people that don't have savings or have little savings have it bad for sure. But
Yeah.
it's not like completely systemic where like the Great Depression they're talking about like anyone with any job, right? Doctors, lawyers, businessmen,
Hmm.
janitors, whatever, are all going through the same thing because
Hmm.
of everything that happened. And so I think it's too early to really compare, but if we were to compare, it's like fits and starts, right? Like certain things, yeah, certain economic indicators for sure. Like if you
Hmm.
have everyone stop spending for half a year, I mean that's gonna take a toll on the economy. That's because the economy is just that's what it's made up of. A huge amount of it is consumption, and if people can't go out and
Right.
buy things, it's a little different when
Right.
people
Right.
aren't used to buying everything online, especially when you can't buy everything online.
Hmm.
And so I think it's early, but I mean, my to go back to kind of your response on it, like I didn't read the whole thing, but I mean, I didn't talk through the whole thing on this video, but I've read the whole thing, and like my kind of thinking was, hey, when I tried to make that presentation, it's actually like a distillation of a lot of the stuff I've read and thought about,
Right.
and so like I kind of felt like your impression of it was like, oh, this is so simple, and like it doesn't really speak to people. But in a way, I think like that's part of what I was going for. I was trying to go for something really simple and elegant, but as I thought about it, I'm also thinking, well, actually, it's hard to. I think this is like the problem with all advice. It's like you just don't have perspective. So if I read a lot and I'm like, okay, these are the best 10 things, but I read 1,000 things or something, then it's just like, okay, but if someone new comes along that didn't read 1,000 things and they're like, well, you only gave me 10 things, it's like, well, what's special about that? Part of what's special is what's not there, and what's not there are all the, like, I don't know, you posted some videos about some guys and we can talk about that, or like all the little things they look at, like more short-term movements and like trying to read into charts or like little economic indicators that come out every week. Like that's the kind of stuff I purposely like excluded, because trying to predict the future is the hardest thing in the world. Like if we actually were very good at that, we could predict the future. Like, you know, whatever, the billionaires, millionaires, or big businesses around the world would be able to do a good job at it, but they obviously can't. It's just something that's really, really hard, whether it be weather or economy. And you know, the economy includes people and psychology and all these things. So that's probably why I excluded a lot of stuff, and maybe like it doesn't really resonate with like what you were saying, like the layperson. It's kind of how my feelings were on it.
Well, all right. So I want to say two things. To respond directly to you, I think probably your presentation was a little too short, or at least the slides that you sent me. Probably a little too short to get people actually started with investing. But,
sure.
You know, it's a process, right? It's a process in learning how to do this sort of thing. And I do think more people need to learn how to invest, because I know so many people that either don't save at all or spend all their money, or if they do save, they just leave it in cash, you know, virtually like a shoebox under their mattress or something like that. You know what I mean? Which is right now probably one of the worst ways you can save your money. So, I think.
So I thought about that too recently as we tried to discuss this, right? And like, before I get to that though, like, I think my presentation slide thing is supposed to be a teaser. It's supposed to provoke conversation. Maybe like this. Like this is maybe more in depth actually than what I thought. But yeah, something like this. It's supposed to say, okay, here's kind of my thinking on it that I've coalesced over all these years. And, you know, you can read it, and it's supposed to be quick. I didn't want it to be long, because I knew the longer it is, the less people want to read it. Like, I like to read long articles and books, but not everyone likes to do that. And so I wanted to make it more visual and almost intuitive. And then it's like, okay, now we have something that you think is interesting, so then let's talk about it. So it's maybe effective. We actually are talking about it. And so on the investment point, then, I do think investing is really important, but I also think it has its place. It's, you know, if I was a young 20-something and I only had $100 to my name, but I had to pay rent, I'm not sure that person should be investing. Like,
I agree.
So you know, I think you have to have a particular safety net for, you know, some amount of time of expenses. Call it, I don't know, in a time like COVID, like maybe you want at least 6 months, you know, maybe at least a month, right? A lot of people are doing paycheck to paycheck, which is tough. But, you know, I kind of like a year or whatever, like however long it takes you think to get a new job, or if you had to change careers, like maybe that's a year, maybe that's 2, maybe that's 6 months, maybe that's 3 months. But some amount of time of actual just cash, I don't know if it's under your mattress, right? But like, in the bank,
well, maybe literally, but not necessarily.
In the bank, hopefully, someplace safe, and that way you have your rainy day fund of like, oh shoot, I lost my job and I had a kid. What do? Like, do I have to live under a bridge? No, I saved a little bit of money. I can pay the bills, and I can look for another job, or focus even on looking for another job instead of like figuring out insurance or something. And so once you've got that, then it's like, okay, now you have money for investing. And I want to differentiate between like investing and like trading too, because it's like there's a lot of people online that are just trying to make a quick buck here and there.
Yes, for sure.
And and that's like a whole nother different ball game. I'm not any
It
good
is.
at it, and I don't really know a lot of people that are good at it, but I'm sure some people are good at it. Maybe it's just luck. Who knows? But that's not what
Yeah.
I'm talking about. So if we're investing for the long term, you have to understand that, if you invest $100, you could easily lose $50 tomorrow, right? Like,
Yeah.
for all we know, and hopefully not, like, some country does some major attack to us, and it could be the next Pearl Harbor, right? And that would be horrible, and stocks would go down, and maybe you won't even care if you lose money because you're worried about your life. But but it could happen. But you have, if you're investing for the long term, and we're talking about retirement, let's say, just for long term, then for a person in their 20s, that's 30 something years. So if you think that you live in a country that's relatively safe, and you think the businesses in that country or in the world even are okay, then you got to have that kind of a horizon. So in 30 years, things will go up and down. At any point in time, it can go down 50%. So you can't have that kind of money like tied up, because if the market goes down 50% and you're invested in the market and you need to pay the bills tomorrow and you lost your job and you had a kid, then it's going to be a tough time for you, right? You're going to have to be pulling out money out of retirement or whatever investment accounts. There may be all sorts of tax penalties and headaches, and you don't want to be going through that when you're particularly stressed too. And so, I think that's the first thing I like. Besides this presentation, I'd say to most people, like, just make sure you got some savings first. If you only got $100 and you need to pay $1,000 in rent next month, like, you don't be investing. Like, you're gambling, right? That's when people talk about like gambling in the markets, and like markets are like casinos. It's like, it shouldn't be like casinos. Like,
It shouldn't be, no.
like, that's not how you should be living. Where it's like, oh, I'm trying to make $100 into $1,000 in a month so I could pay rent. You're asking for trouble, because the odds are not in your favor. You're not doing this all the time. You're unlikely to be an expert or very good, and so.
Yeah. Well, a couple things with that. There's, under the CARES Act, people are allowed to borrow from their retirement funds, and they can pay it back, but apparently not a lot of people are taking advantage of that. It is one provision under the CARES Act, I believe. The other thing is that you really don't want to try to do that, because if you're not able to pay it back in time, you potentially could miss out on a lot of gains if you were still invested. But understandably, if you're taking money out from that, it's probably looking pretty serious. So you need that money, and that's understandable.
I mean,
it's just that there's an option there for people if they need to.
I mean,
so they won't get penalized if they're withdrawing from like a traditional IRA or something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, the CARES Act stuff, like I mentioned the tax stuff, but like, end of the day, that's a minor thing, right? Big picture is have a safety net. Next big picture is investing long term. Next big picture is how do you even do that? Like, most likely just a regular market index, I think, for most people. And then we can talk about specifics about like, what do you think is going to happen tomorrow?
Right.
Like, I mean, you even talked about like, now might be a bad time to pull out money because you might be able to make more money. But like, I don't think that's not the focus. The focus is actually not losing money, right? Like, you first have to survive, and then you thrive. Like, if you risk your survival, then you're not going to be able to, like you said, like, be able to put in like $10,000 or whatever when the market's down, because you got to pay rent. If you have the savings and you're like, oh, okay, now I can safely pay rent, and I'm pretty confident I can get a new job in a few weeks or something, then go for it and put more money in and invest. But make sure you got your like main bases covered first, and then you can go into the optionality of like, okay, I have potential upside here, and it's okay if it goes down 50%, because end of the day, I'm investing for 30 years, right? You gotta keep that perspective. Like, the short-term perspective is like, oh, I'm trying to make some money here, but the long-term perspective is really like, I'm trying to make money for 30 years time, not because the market's down or up a little bit today, but for 30 years time. And I can go more into it, but I also think it's kind of a simple thing. It's just math. Like, maybe math isn't that complicated. Maybe math is kind of complicated for a lot of people, but I think it's just math. Like, if anyone just wrote it down or put it in Excel Like
Mhm.
you made, one column for each year for 30 years, and then you started with some money, or you regularly put in a certain amount of money every year. It adds up, and you don't have to be the greatest investor. You just have to have first saved and then second invested.
Mhm. Mhm.